Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again with another edition of Starter Builds for a new league, and this time around we are talking about Scourge League. Now, as always, these sort of starter builds from me are largely just very much to start yourself off and get yourself through to like white maps, yellow maps, and feel pretty comfortable doing so. I always try and give some slightly hipster and, not too obvious options, and then they're not builds that go all the way through to the end of the game unless you put some serious investment into it, but they are cheap, usually pretty fun, and just nice little templates to get you through the campaign, through early maps, and then maybe start thinking about another character. But of course you can go around and explore many other content creators' videos and pick some more meta builds if you really want, as there are many people that, these days that put a lot of effort into their starter builds and try and make sure they are builds that go all the way through the game, whereas I am really much more of a hands-on sort of learner, and I'm not much for theory crafting perfect builds or anything. I'd rather do it during the league as I slowly make builds and progress build by build. So without further ado, I will jump into first build, and let's call it Exsanguinate Scion. So Exsanguinate is a skill that came out a couple leagues ago, and it is pure physical with a large physical damage over time attached to it. It is these bloody tendrils that uses life to cast as an ability, and if you attach chain to it, it becomes an extremely potent map clearing ability with a solid enough base for single target damage, especially if you add in Corrupting Fever, which is another life damage over time buff that you attach to yourself. And I started this character as a Elementalist when the skill first came out, and it was an extremely strong starter for myself that took me to level 95. Elementalist has seen some revisions since then, and it's not quite as comfortable as a starter for this type of a thing, but Scion, with a few of the new tricks and tools, I think looks rather nice, and I'm going to try and make a starter for you guys here that has a pretty large amount of block and spell suppression, and then hopefully a large enough amount of life, recovery, and also damage to get yourself going through the early game off of very little gear. And I think it should be a very nice starter, especially for some of the new league mechanic as well, where if you get overwhelmed, things like Exsanguinate with chain clear things up real nice. So here is the, I'd say sort of humble mock-up I made of a Scion for Exsanguinate, and it is based off of a Gladiator Ascendancy and the Raider Ascendancy. The Gladiator one being the focal point here because it's got 20% more physical damage over time, bit of extra block, so just some defense, and then the Raider helps you zoom a bit more with movement speed, onslaught, get some frenzies, get your phasing, and also chance to suppress. So I've built off of both of those defensive mechanics here and tried my best to get a decent amount of block, decent amount of spell suppression, and still tried to maintain a good bit of damage in the build. It ends up being a little bit less damage than the Elementalist that I put up as a starter a few leagues ago, but that was actually still pretty good considering the gear that it had, and I think this should end up being somewhat competitive. And as well as that, when you first start out, you do get a lot of your damage scaling very early on, because these are your main damage nodes over here, 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 and then going up and just starting to fill out life and all of that, and the rest is basically up to gem levels and then just getting a bit of extra dual sockets damage. So trying to dual wield your cold iron points, and we've got dual wield block up to about 72 at the moment, though we can get a bit more with the mastery for dual wield, which I haven't taken, but it's up to you if you want to take it just for the 15 block. If you haven't blocked recently, that definitely caps you out on block. Otherwise, the gear is basically just try and get an additional curse on your chest, so that's going to be a hunter chest. Physical damage over time multi for your amulets, your gloves, poacher's mark on a ring, and that's about it. Everything else is pretty basic. Your 6-link for Exsanguinate, Brutality, Control Destruction, Swift Affliction, Cruelty, and Efficacy. But if Cruelty seems to not be hitting maximum a lot of the time, and it should, then you can swap in Life Tap, and Chain is going to be your swap in instead of Swift Affliction whenever you're doing any clearing. So basically, put in Swift Affliction when you are starting to go for some single target damage. Of course, you want your Corrupting Fever up as well on a 4-link. That's Brutality, Swift Affliction, Efficacy. That's the one that costs a bunch of life to start with, but then refreshes as you use your other ability, and it's just a bunch of extra damage over time. Nothing really else to mention, I don't think. Pride, you got your Herald of Purity attached to your main, some Vitality for regen, Stormbrand that attaches to Hex Touch, and Vulnerability and Arcane Surge. Mostly going to be for a bit of extra single target. And the passive tree in the Raider side is what you take kind of a bit later that lets you, if you want, you can spec down towards it early on. But once you actually get your lab to go this way, that's when you start filling out a lot of your spell suppression and a bit of extra movement speed, some block, that type of shit. So yeah, hopefully it's a good one. It's somewhat provisional, but Exsanguinate's pretty good and feels pretty good to level with absolutely no gear. Next up is what looks like it might be somewhat meta and a lot of people are pretty keen to try, and that is the new flask throwing skill, Poisonous Concoction. So last league they introduced this flask skill. It was Explosive Concoction, and they've made a few adjustments to it to make it more playable, and hopefully learnt from that for this one as well. And it looks like it's got some pretty damn good numbers for it. Poison in general is a pretty nice safe starter for any skill that is already built heavily into poison. Just go Pathfinder, get a few links, get a few damage over times on the tree, and it basically builds itself for damage early on. You really don't need much, and it feels very smooth. With the new masteries, it seems like there's definitely going to be some nice poison starters out there, because they help you get your poison rolling a lot quicker into your passive tree and your gear and all that. And Poisonous Concoction itself has some pretty good numbers behind it. So one of the good things about this skill and this sort of starter type is that it can sort of fall back on a few other things. If it fails, you can then play Cobra Lash or Scourge Arrow, Toxic Rain, something like that, and still get some pretty good success going. But the numbers behind this thing look pretty good, and the passive tree looks like it should start out strong. I have in the configuration down here added what is essentially going to be the amount of damage that Poisonous Concoction adds through the skill gem, and that's how we can simulate some of the damage. So it should have about this much added chaos from the skill gem itself and from the flask that we have, which will be something like this, just a life flask that does a bunch of regen to start with. It doesn't scale off of the passive tree increased regen node, so increased life flask recovery doesn't increase the damage from the gem in the end. And then 400% more damage because this type of a skill, flask throwing, does have overlap with additional projectiles. So if you can get more projectiles and they hit the target and all overlap, it should be just pure more multipliers. And in this case, we're using GMP, so it should give us 4 additional projectiles, thus totaling 5 projectiles, 400% more damage. I hope that's how it works, but if I'm wrong, fuck. In any case, the passive tree itself starts out pretty comfortably. I'd say you're going down this way and getting straight into the poisonous stuff early on, because there is a lot of good stuff to be taken. So I don't think I've actually done what we're supposed to. I accidentally unclicked it. One of the first things you'll grab if you get enough poison on hit, which you should, start out with your Cobra Lash, grab your Explosive Concoction at level 12, I think. With lesser poison, you've pretty much got a 100% chance to poison. And then if you grab Poison Inflict on non-poison enemies, 300% increased damage, that should really help you clear just about everything in one hit and one poison pretty comfortably. You can then also get a lot of extra sustain through the mastery for 3% life on killing a poisoned enemy, and those things should really get you going. We then spec into this little claw wheel because it's got a bit of generic poison stuff, but as well as that, attack and life leech, so that helps us get everything rolling. And then there's a lot on the tree for additional flask stuff, recovery of your life flask and all that, and we won't really know how much you're going to need all of that, but there's plenty to get. So got a few nodes there, and take the masteries as you feel you need them, because there's more in there if you really want them. Tried to build into a little bit of block and some spell suppress as well, and ultimately it's up to your gear to kind of fix all that up. But passive tree goes all the way up here, takes some extra chaos stuff, and the masteries are going to be kind of up to what your gear and you know, character progression feels like. So Lycosidae, if you can get one, just to make sure that you won't ever miss. But your gear, aside from that, can fix up accuracy if you want a better shield, or if you can get a better shield, and if you can get the accuracy elsewhere. Otherwise, you really want the focus craft, just so for boss fights you'll be pressing this button for focus, and it's a bunch of extra duration on ailments. Otherwise, bit of Chaos Dot multi, Despair Ring, and you're running an additional Plague Bearer for single target damage or just general clear. It does help in these poison builds. Vile Blight for additional single target. Your reservations should probably be Herald of Agony, Vitality, Skitterbots, Precision, if you don't have a Lycosidae yet. Otherwise, you could get rid of these and start running something like Malevolence instead. Entirely up to you guys. And then the links, I feel, should be LMP as soon as you can get it, or Volley into GMP, and then Unbound Ailments, Deadly Ailments, Vicious Approach, Void Manip. Could also use Vile Toxins. Currently Chance to Poison, since I think I'm a little bit off the poison cap potentially, since we don't have the poison incorporated into the skill at the moment, but the skill itself has 40% chance to poison as well. So looks pretty good, and I think a lot of people are going to be jumping into this one as their first character from many other build creators as well. Next up is what I will probably be playing myself, and that is Spectral Helix Raider. I did start one of these at the start of last league, but it was on SSF and Hardcore, and it still went very well. I was pretty happy with how the build went, and I was thoroughly enjoying the new skill that was Spectral Helix. But this time around there is also another new skill in the form of Tornado, which might be able to synergize with it. Either way, there's a bunch of new tools through the skill tree, passive tree, and some masteries and stuff that I think could be interesting for Spectral Helix, and on top of that, more of a soft core approach. So going to try and still get a bunch of spell suppression, bunch of evasion, but we'll be Spectral Helixing through claws, dual wield claws, and should be a very fast play style, fairly thick, you know, just good avoidance and good recovery, and I'm hoping just another bunch of fun in the form of Spectral Helix. But if the Tornado proves like it synergizes well with this, then it could actually be a real winner of a build. But that is to be seen, and something I'm going to be figuring out as I go. But I'm a fan of Spectral Helix, and that's why I want to give it a shot, even though it's a bit more of a gear-heavy skill and build type. So there will be a few different ways that you can build a pretty, cheap Spectral Helix, either full cold and using Ice Bite. But this example of a build that I'm trying here is going to be using added lightning and added cold gems, and then a Trinity support. So about half of our damage is lightning, half is cold, and for Trinity to work effectively, you need basically two different elements to be kind of changing which one's doing the most damage occasionally. So as you can see, our lightning will sometimes hit the hardest, and our cold will sometimes hit a little bit harder. So then Trinity should be up at 50 resonation stacks almost always. So the actual links are utilizing Nightblade, since we are dual claws, and then added cold, added lightning, and Trinity, and then chuck in a elemental damage with attacks as a sixth link if we get that far. But should be pretty humble claws, just as much LE, attack speed, and crit as you can get, and the passive tree provides us with lots of cool shit. So we'd probably go down to begin with and pick up the 50 life mastery as soon as you can over here, but we're kind of just interested in getting our approach speed up as soon as possible, since that's what gives you more of your clear speed and sort of feeling good in the build. And I also really want to try out this knockback enemies with crit thing. Maybe that just helps enemies walk into our Spectral Helixes continuously, and also an added layer of defense. On top of that, you can start picking up claw nodes. It kind of just builds itself. Get leech whenever you feel like you need it from the mastery, and I am a little bit over budget on points here for level 94, but just kind of prioritize what you need. A little bit more damage, maybe a little bit more life or suppression or whatever it is. but plenty of good stuff to get there. And I think Spectral Helix should be a lot of fun. And then on top of that, maybe the Tornado gives us a bunch more damage. The Ascendancy points we're going for, it's kind of hard to say what you'd be doing first of all. It really depends on what you're going to prioritize for defense, offense. I'd probably be going the Frenzy charges though. We'll have to wait and see how it's playing out while leveling. There's no real wrong answer. You could either go the full Frenzies or the full phasing, suppression, and extra damage as well as extra avoidance from elements while phasing over here. And you can, even if you really want, go full onslaught that way, but I'm going a bit more for the damage side of things with the frenzies. And then the last starter I'll share is going to be just an attempt at an update on a crowd-pleasing Cyclone Chieftain. When I first started this build as a starter a few leagues back, it was probably the most successful starting build I've ever had, and it's gone under a few revisions here or there, and sadly I don't think it's as strong as it used to be, because a lot of the power in the new passive tree is behind masteries, and the staff masteries are just extremely lacking, so you don't really get much extra juice there from the new passive tree. And just through some nerfs and stuff last league, I do think it's a weaker build than it used to be, but it's still definitely good enough to be a starter for anyone that would want something that's you know, a bit cyclone-y, a bit melee, and still has some good explosions. The build is based around staffs, cyclone, and then the shockwave support gem that kind of just is a delivery system, using Cyclone as a delivery system to trigger, and then you just get big explosions, and it still feels fairly decent for overall gameplay up until red and hard tier bosses. So with this character, I have just tried to kind of adapt my actual starting chieftain from a few leagues back. That's all of his gear set that I got while just building the character, so some of it might look a bit out of range, since it did take me to like level 95 to build this entire thing together. But a Hedges era staff, as always, still pretty damn easy to get early on, and should be a staple. And then I've just tried to rework the passive tree for a more modern version of the build, but there were a couple things that were missing. So there was a good staff node over here that gave a bunch of accuracy that we can no longer grab, and we've kind of got to take on wavering a bit off to the side. So overall it is a bit of a worse passive tree than it used to be, I think. And then the staff masteries do nothing. They're just not very good for pretty much any build. And then we've got a few other cool masteries from like fire, so a bit of fire exposure. You still do want a cluster jewel to do cremator, so that enemies you ignite, their corpses are destroyed on kill. That makes the build feel quite a bit nicer. And then if you can, cooked alive or the exposure jewel, exposure node would be pretty good too. And your exposure will otherwise come from a custom damage taken wave of conviction, or the storm brand attached to power charge on crit, or an Arcanist brand attached to wave of conviction. But typically it's going to come from this cast when damage taken. The build basically, like I said, revolves around Cyclone, and then using Shockwave, Pulverize, things like that. As soon as you start getting those at level 28, that's when it really takes off, but you can level with anything you want, and transition when you're ready to do so. You can level with maces as well, but you definitely need maces or staves for Shockwave to start working. And then the real power of the build is, as always, through the additional buffs that the War Chief and the Protector grant, thanks to the ascendancies over here. 100% increased buff effect, and then you really want to also anoint Panopticon, and then once you have your totems down, both of them, you get quite a lot of extra damage. Your ascendancy order is probably still going to be Namahu's Flame into Hinokora and then into Tukohama, but entirely up to you if you want to start getting more damage out of totems early on. Should still be an okay build, nowhere near as powerful I don't think as it used to be, but it has the potential to be min-maxed and geared up and probably take on the end game still, and probably somewhat versatile in that you can build a bit thicker or a bit thinner, up to you entirely if you want more damage or more life, etc. But still want to give some sort of attempt at a revamp for people that want to try this guy again, and yeah, that's the best I could do off of just a little bit of effort. Now that is the end of the actual starters, but I will just give you a few passive trees basically. So I haven't played a lot of these builds, just put together some passive trees in case you want to like follow some sort of small passive tree guideline for some of these things. And that will be Chaos Slinging, so basically Spell Slinger with Soul Rend and as an occultist. So haven't really done one of those in a couple years, anything to do with Soul Rend, but that's just going to be a tree for that. Likewise for cold damage over time occultist, I'll just give you a tree for that. And then Ellie hit Deadeye, a more modern version of the tree for this type of a build, but you can just refer to my past guide for this character, and it's still pretty relevant, I think, just a bit more gear heavy on the top end. And then as well as that, a Stormbrand Inquisitor starter, give you a tree for that. So it's not a fully fleshed out starter build, but I do think Stormbrand Inquisitor should be a pretty damn nice start, given that you get all of your brand stuff very early on now. So your power spike should just keep happening every few levels, and then by like level 40 you're pretty much a full built character and you just start taking some quality of life things. And then Stormburst Totems, I'll attach that as well. I think Stormburst Totems should be a pretty cool build if you want to try something as Totems. Can be an Inquisitor, can be a Hierophant, but I think Totems are also benefiting quite nicely from a lot of these masteries out there. And I think one other thing, one of my viewers and moderators and dudes that hangs around a lot, and I am particularly fond of, is giving us a his template for an Energy Blade build. So Energy Blade does look pretty scuffed, and it does look like it's going to take some gear and some work, but I just made a little mock-up for a Inquisitor. I had no desire of doing this shit myself, trying to make this work without actually, you know, having the skill in my hands. But he went ahead and gave it a shot, and if you want this as a template just to have a look at what Energy Blade might look at, I think it looks like he's thought of plenty of things. Basically, attach the damage that you should get from it onto the weapon, and then the 80 less multiplier for your ES over here. And you can have a look at what the tree might look like as an Inquisitor and how this type of a build with Energy Blade might work. Once again, highly provisional, so be wary. And that's all. So I hope you guys enjoyed the little start build video. I don't think they're particularly ever potent starters compared to what some people might be putting out as pure meta builds, but they should definitely get you going, and they're good enough for me to get into the maps and start having fun and exploring stuff on day one. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you guys have a great league start, and see you next time.